Sorry to drag you out of bed so early on a Monday morning. To begin with, let me just give a brief anecdotal story just to set the scene of what we're trying to talk about today. The year was 1993, January. It was Davos World Economic Forum in Switzerland. And note the timing, 1993. Nelson Mandela went to Davos that year. The ANC was a government in waiting almost, and Nelson Mandela was a president in waiting. And the world was looking at South Africa and saying, well, what's going to happen next? Over dinner one evening, there was a, Mandela was sitting with a number of it was a South Africa evening, that evening. And over dinner, Mandela was sitting with a few South African business people, and also on that table was Lee Peng. Lee Peng at the time was the Prime Minister of the People's Republic of China. And the question inevitably came up, if you cast your minds back to 1993, the question was posed to Mr. Mandela, was, Mr. Mandela, with all due respect, what are you going to do? Are you going to nationalize the large swathes of South African industry, including the banks and the mining sector? And this was on the cards. We used to debate it, if you recall. Mr. Mandela went on this long answer about the Freedom Charter and the need to include the masses into the economy, etc., etc. After a long sort of answer, he was hinting toward a nationalization. After a long answer, Prime Minister Lee Peng, the Prime Minister of the world's largest communist republic, the People's Republic of China, turned to Mr. Mandela and said, Mr. Mandela, you shouldn't nationalize. You should privatize instead. Now note the year, 1993, this is 16 years ago. And here we have the Prime Minister of the world's largest communist state advocating privatization. Now, I think all of what we hear about today is we're all here this morning to hear about China. And China's taken us all, I think, by very rapid surprise in recent years. And it wasn't too long ago that China was being accused of being labeled a free rider in the global economy. You heard that term? Free rider? Yeah. Now, seemingly, everyone is looking towards China as some sort of savior economy. The only economy, perhaps, that is growing at potentially 7-8% plus at the height of a global recession/depression. Can anyone think of any economy growing at 7-8% in 1931? There wasn't. So China's gone from demon to sudden savior, and I think rewinding 16 years ago to that World Economic Forum session Davos, you ask yourself the question, well, you assume that China seems to be having an impact on South Africa a long time, even compared to this last 2, 3, 4 years, where there's this China frenzy that has arisen. So, sorry, to get to the formal part, we have, excuse me a second, let me bring this up. Sorry, I need to take off the branding. Okay. This is why we're here today. This slide, simple. It's the growth trajectories of Africa, or the growth performance, historical performance of the GDP of Africa as a continent and the GDP of China as a country. I heard a great phrase once. China is a civilization pretending to be a nation state. Anyway, as an aside. But this is the kind of argument here that I want to make, is that growth differentials, there was just absolutely no correlation whatsoever going back to up until the early 90s. Now, all these very clever people in the world in recent years have been coming up with theories. The one theory which has been shown to be basically kaput is that of decoupling. Heard of decoupling? Mm-hmm. There's this notion somehow that there will be a decoupling of the global economy. Picture a world map. You have high growth eastern economies led by China, India, to an extent Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, and then relatively slow growth western economies, Western Europe and the US, decoupling. And it doesn't matter what really happens in the US, regardless, economic performance would remain strong in the eastern part of the hemisphere. That's decoupling. Now we know it's nonsense, is it not? Okay. So rather than decoupling, I think the phrase I would use is new coupling. The new coupling of African growth and Chinese growth. And more on this later. But particularly, there's 3 key years. From 1996, we started seeing a trend of correlation between Chinese growth and African growth. This was on the back of the commodities demand cycle, so-called super cycle. Bit of a super cycle of commodities here. Now suffering a bit of a flat tire, but regardless. 1996 and then thereafter particularly, we see from 1999, there's an exact correlation of Chinese and African growth. Differential between 3 to 5%, that gap, which is that there. And then we see 2007, where growth in China has literally fallen off a cliff. Those of you who've been there the last 3 months, compared to what it was a year ago, even 2 years ago, will certainly understand and witness what is taking place in China currently. So this is the China-Africa growth coupling or new coupling. And I think this is why it's imperative we're talking about this today, because seemingly what happens in China happens to us. Because the economic growth performance of Africa over the last 2 years, according to the OECD last year, 6.5%. That's very robust growth, has been underpinned by China's demand for commodities. There's big sucking sound here for commodities, both solid minerals, liquid energy, particularly from Africa, being imported, exported at least to the Chinese economy. Now, all of us have a perception. Sorry, can I ask you to raise your hands? Who has been to China in the room? Hands up, please. Okay, a few of you, but a minority. Who's been to London? Hands up. Okay. I don't need to say anymore. But how do we view China? Now, those of you who've been to China, let's be honest. Before you went, your perception of China was entirely different 12 hours later, 13 hours later when you arrived. Not so. Very different. I still hear the word red China. Excuse a red tie, but red China or communist China or Chairman Mao and all of this sort of stuff. It's obsolete. Practically all our views, I can tell you, all our views or perceptions of ideas we have of China are mostly about 3 decades obsolete. So when Zapiro's not drawing Jacob Zuma cartoons, he occasionally does some others. But this was in June 2006, down here in Cape Town. We had Premier Wen Jiabao, who's China's number 2. Came out to Cape Town, had an essay, China Business Forum. And at the time, if anyone's read this week, I must put a plug to the sponsors. This week's Fin Week magazine, have you read it? It's called, I think the article is about Stitched Up or something. It's challenges facing the textile garment sector here in South Africa. Largely because of deindustrialization and inability to compete at a manufacturing level with Chinese companies. Okay, this week's cover story, Fin Week. Okay. But it goes back numerous years. In even 2006, there we have our former president, Thabo Mbeki, sitting in the corner, saying that, oh, thanks, could you offer a bit less, and these big jobs are going to China. Is that a correct perception we have in South Africa? I think it is. And Kasatu would certainly agree with this. Secondly, we have the Asian tsunami. I hate that word, but the Asian tsunami of manufactured goods swamping Africa. There's this tidal wave. And our trade and industry departments are kind of running to the hills for cover. Again, deindustrialization. And the phrase would be perhaps is not so much how do we compete, but maybe rather, will we survive? The third one, contentiously, and Glenn, we spoke about this in great detail, is, remember last year, our Minister of Labour made some extremely unfortunate and insulting remarks about the ethnic Chinese community here in South Africa. Approximately a group of people, 8,500 to 10,000 strong. These are not Chinese, these are South Africans. And this is how, I think, which last year, this notion of Chinese South Africans. The reason why I mentioned this was that the Chinese government took great umbrage to the comments made by certain of our cabinet ministers and how this whole process was treated. So much so that, don't quote me on this, but an apology was expected from a PRC government of how the ethnic Chinese in this country were treated last year. Comments made by cabinet, particularly around this issue. And the last one is a bit of a joke. There's our friend Bob, and talking about colonization, the C word. And let's talk about it as well this morning. The C word. It's a very dirty word these days in this part of the world. But we have the Chinese chap arriving. Sorry, it's a bit slow. The Chinese chap arriving, and will never ever be colonized again. Zimbabwe has become a major, or is a major economic actor in Zimbabwe. We're certainly the largest foreign investors, the largest trading partner, so we shouldn't really throw stones in glass houses. But nevertheless, the Chinese certainly are becoming pretty active, pretty assertive in that province we have to the north. Apologies for the Zimbabweans. Ambassador Liu Guichen, just as an aside, our perceptions of China, those of you who haven't been to China, I think these would maybe be stronger than those of you who have been to China, is this notion of, if you watch the BBC, heaven forbid you watch CNN, or you read FT amongst others, it's always, you can never read an article about China where the word colonialist is not used, or human rights issues, or corporate social responsibility. And any Chinese investor seemingly is characterized as someone who's going to abuse labor rights, destroy their environment, and leave at the first opportunity. That's sort of a very, very negative perception, I think, and a very misinformed and misguided one often. Ambassador Liu Guichen was former ambassador in Pretoria, the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs. And he said at WF last year, he made this comment in a session that was going on. And I think it's very true. There's been an enormous amount of negativity towards Chinese investment and engagement of a continent. Misplaced negativity, I might add as well. Now, sorry, this is the formal part. The headlines, firstly, is this new coupling I spoke about. Let me explain it slightly more differently. Is in about 1999, 2000, China's new Africa policy came about. 10 years ago, exactly this year, 10 years ago. Our friends in Beijing State Council, which is kind of China's super cabinet, 9 guys. 9 guys run China effectively. In the State Council, thought that, for us to grow as an economy at 10%, 11, 12, 13, whatever, for the next 30, 40, 50 years, which is possible, it is essential, it is absolutely imperative for the Chinese economy to have imports, a guaranteed supply line, importation of key commodity and energy assets. Is it not? Obviously, it comes back as manufactured products, but you've seen the infrastructure development in everywhere across China. It's not just Shanghai. Second-tier, third-tier cities, the infrastructure growth. The demand for commodities is seemingly endless. The realization in China in 1999 was, this growth thing we've got going here is big, and it could easily go for another 20, 30, 40 years. Where are these commodities going to come from? They come from Africa. It's the best place to get them. We are able to, Africa strategically open. It is not locked down by US interests, such as the Middle East, or European traditional to an extent. But relatively speaking, Africa is strategically open. Now, at the same time, and that earlier chart proved it, the growth trajectories, which were kind of in parallel almost, basic word parallel, shows that Africa's growth has been underpinned by this demand for commodities in China. So effectively, one could assume, one could say, and I would say, this new coupling, is that China's growth is dependent on Africa's ability to supply these commodities. The counterweight to that is that Africa's growth is dependent upon Chinese demand. So we have this new coupling, that both the growth trajectories, destinies almost, are intertwined. This is the new coupling of our growth prospects, of our economies. We're dependent on Chinese demand. China is dependent on our ability to supply. And you wonder why, those of you who travel to the north of South Africa, you wonder why the Chinese are building roads, rail projects, ports. Why? To alleviate supply-side infrastructure constraints and bottlenecks. Simple. That's why China's building roads. Realization was 10 years ago that that was the strategic play toward the continent. New risk model. Seemingly, you know, the Chinese are everywhere. They're in Zim, they're in Sudan, they're in Angola. Anyone who works for Imperial here? Nobody? You have a problem you've been having in Angola recently? It's also in Finland. I read in the plane last night. In Angola, in Nigeria. These are very politically contentious, very difficult African economies in which to do business. But the Chinese investing massive amounts of money. 4.5 billion credit facility in Angola. 9.3 billion recently announced in the DRC. About 5 billion in investment to the national oil corporations in Sudan. These are big numbers, massive numbers. Zim, we don't know the figures, but it's pretty big. These are very, very big numbers. So the question is, well, do Chinese investors, do Chinese emerging multinationals or companies have some sort of differing perception or calculation of risk? That's the question. I believe to an extent, yes, based on the financing model. The financing model is so-called a concessional finance model, where you have, in this country, we have the banks. All the banks, Standard, Nedbank, ABSA, First Rand, Investec, are private banks, and they'll lend money on the merits, not so. China's context, you have policy banks, you have commercial banks. The policy banks lend more on a basis of policy often than real commercial intent. That's a very simple way to put it. But don't get me wrong, I'm not against this model. Let me explain. In the DRC's case, you have read this $9.5 or $9.3 billion package deal recently, last year. You recall it? Big, big figures. The largest investment in Central Africa ever, period, full stop. What effectively it is, you have a cash injection going into Jacobin, the national mining company, to recapitalize it. You have at the same time the commodity offtake arrangement for 15, 20 years, whatever it is, calculated at a market-related price. You have money going to the pot which is effectively a venture capital fund that Chinese firms to take up and to roll out infrastructure in the country. And then you have the traditional sort of aid as well, schools, the hospitals, the training, whatever. And it's all lumped together, and that's the concessional finance model. The difference is between the Chinese approach and the European approach. The Chinese do not pretend, like the Europeans do, that somehow they don't want to make money out of the process. Which is not a bad thing. Look at aid to Africa. The only country I know, now think about the north, okay? The only country I know that's ever gotten wealthy on aid. Any ideas? Huh? I would say the Vatican. So unless you want to start a religion, forget about it. The Vatican is probably the only country ever got wealthy through donations. So, the Chinese approach, at least, I'll talk about this shortly, is a new developmental offering, perhaps. One which combines business with state financial enablement and ultimately is based on a profit-seeking motivation. Profit should not be, amongst many of the NGO community, profit's a dirty word. It should not be. It should be embraced. Third scramble. Now, the first scramble, was back in the day. Remember when Jan van Riebeck arrived and the boys? Just down the road here. And then the Portuguese kind of came, a bit earlier actually, I think. The British came, the Germans came, the Italians came a little bit, the French came. And it was about ego, it was about real estate. Stake your claim. mark out your border, draw a line. Have you ever seen such a long line as that Namibian border? Some guy just went with a ruler, straight down. That was the first scramble for Africa, the real big C word, colonialism. The second scramble came to Africa post-45. So particularly around 60s odd when African states started to gain their independence, late 50s, early 60s, where it was about ideology. You were Eastern camp, you were a communist, whatever that is these days, I'm not sure, whether you were socialist or you were Western aligned, you were free market, you were liberal, you were democratic, etc., supposedly. So East-West camps. In 1989, that all changed. That was the second scramble for Africa. Left us with nothing at all, except legacy issues, not good ones. The third scramble for Africa, I believe, started about 10 years ago with China's move towards the continent. And China undoubtedly put Africa back on the global economic map. It did. Because all of a sudden, everyone was saying, in Britain, in France, in the US, even in Russia and India and China, were saying, well, China not already, but saying that, what's going on down there? Those Chinese are scrambling for resources. They're buying up whatever they can, seemingly in the commodities, the energy space. They're building infrastructure. What are those guys doing? Are they seeing something that we are not? That was the point. I think it's the correct one. You know Sir Sam Jonah, the head of Jonah Capital, former AngloGold Ashanti CEO? He was talking in Johannesburg last year and he was berating South African business for losing out on opportunity when compared to our Chinese, Indian, Brazilian, and even Russian competitors in our own African backyard. I think it's a very valid point. Special economic zones. Has anyone heard of this process? In November 2006, the PRC government, President Hu Jintao, number one in China, stood up and said in Beijing, we're going to establish 3 to 5 special economic zones in Africa in the next 3 years. So far, there's about 10, 2 years later. Now, I'll show a map shortly where you have these zones that have been established across the continent, effectively Chinatowns on commercial steroids. That's what they are. You know, everywhere you go in the world, you go to London, San Francisco, I was in Brussels recently, I even saw them there. There's a Chinatown, everywhere you go, isn't there? It's a social sort of ethnic phenomenon for Chinese to cluster. In commerce, it's not too different. We're seeing these special economic zones, state-financed, enabling finance, venture capital funds for Chinese firms to get a foothold in Africa at relatively low cost of capital. Probably a good thing. And the challenge of trust. I asked you all about, about perceptions. And we all have our views about China. Some may be negative, some may be indifferent, some may think China is the greatest thing ever. But, you know, all of you been to London mostly. We're all comfortable going to Perth, or London, or New York, or, you know, any European sort of city. Because, hey, people look the same, they sound the same, we can read the language pretty much most of the time, we can get into a taxi without too much hassle, and we're comfortable there. We're in this thing which has often been referred to as the WBM. You heard of WBM? It's not a BMW for dyslexics. It's the Western business model. We're in that frame. This Western business model sort of space. But we're comfortable being in Oz and the UK, North America. I think the biggest challenge for Chinese and Africans to build sustainable economic business partnerships is this notion of trust. A Japanese-American academic wrote a book called Trust, Francis Fukuyama, back in the, early mid-90s, thereabouts. Trust. It was about this, trust between states, between civilizations, between groups. And, you know, we always say, you know, you go to West Africa, people speak French. because the French were there. You come to Southern Africa, East Africa, people speak English, because we're English we're here. Similarly so in Lusophone Africa, in Angola, in Mozambique, etc. Now, no one speaks Chinese really. I was in Kenya last year at the airport, and I heard some guys talking Chinese, and I turned around and they were local Kenyans, talking Chinese to some Chinese business people. It's quite amazing to hear it in the queue at the airport. If they were talking English or French, it's like, that's what you do, not so. So, I think the biggest issue, and many of our perceptions and views of China are clouded by this issue of trust in the broader context of the word. Now, if I can briefly go through this. China's drivers to Africa. Why is China coming to Africa beyond commodities? Now, that's obviously a factor. The first one is Africa as an emerging market. Now, for those African pessimists here, I'm sure there's many of you, positive or otherwise, is there are equal number of poor Chinese as there are poor Africans. There's about 900 odd million people on this continent, and there's about 700 odd million Chinese peasants. Peasants, real peasants, you know. So China's the #1 uber emerging market, the biggest letter in BRIC. Brazil, Russia, India, China. C is the big one. And yet Africa's a basket case. Of course, we're not one country, but hey, you know, it's a lot of... India's not one country, by the way. They pretend to be. But Chinese investors see Africa as an emerging market, not as some place you have to fly over to get to London. I'm being slightly cruel here. But I think you see the Chinese companies coming in, be it on the mobile telecom side, on the consumer side, on the trade side. It is a massive opportunity for Chinese companies, or anyone really, but Chinese companies are certainly taking advantage of it. You speak to YT Basson from ShopRite, they'll tell you exactly the same. ShopRite has a target of 500 new stores on this continent by 2013. That's phenomenal growth. Their growth is coming from Africa now, not South Africa, the primary driver of their growth. Energy security. Remember that guy, distant memory, George Bush? Huh? What did George Bush, we did many things, but what did he do in 2003 in particular? Anyone remember? He saw this place on a map called Iraq, and he thought, that looks like good real estate. It's got oil there. Let's go. So he did. The Americans invaded Iraq in 2003, March. I was in Beijing at the time. I can tell you, the policymakers in Beijing, in government, were freaked out by this. Again, the US has got the Middle East strategically locked down. Name me one Middle Eastern democracy, by the way. Yeah. So, strategic lockdown of the Middle East. Second thing happened 2005. 2005, the Japanese government, the Russian government concluded the energy pipeline, 4,000 kilometers LNG gas pipeline under the sea from Russia to Japan. $5 billion project. It wasn't about money. Moscow, Tokyo strategically excluded China from that project. There was going to be a dogleg route down to the south to China. They cut it. China was feeling isolated by that. Now, all of this, the third thing happened in 2005, mid-2005. CNOOC, China National Overseas Oil Corporation, one of the energy majors, one of the biggest investors in Nigeria, tried to buy an American company called Unocal. Remember that, 2005, 3.5, 4 years ago? Unocal, US energy major, privately owned company. Great offer for shareholders. It's about 17, 18 billion US dollars. It made good sense for everybody. US Congress intervened and said, sorry, you can't buy that private asset, private company. It's strategic. Political intervention stopped the deal. Unocal was forced to decline the offer by CNOOC, the National Overseas Oil Corporation. Our friends in Beijing were really upset by that. So these three events, George Bush, Iraq, energy pipeline, Japan, Russia, and failed acquisition of Unicol reinforced the sense of energy insecurity in China. 90-odd% of China's energy, 92-93%, comes from coal. That's why they have pollution problems, very bad ones. At the same time, if you track on a timeline, CNOOC went into Nigeria, $2.27 billion investment. Sinopec went into Angola, $4.5 billion. Sinopec similarly, Sudan, all around the same time. It was an attempt by the state to secure energy assets. So that's why they come into Africa as well. Third reason, sorry, I'll fly through these. Commercial learning ground. There's about 1,000 odd Chinese firms of consequence in Africa, big ones, private, state-owned, somewhere in between, active in Africa. These firms are being pushed out, literally pushed out, incentivized out of China to go and learn to become an emerging market, emerging multinational, in emerging markets. Go to Africa. Cost of failure is not that high. Cost of assets is low. Don't go to the US and Europe. You can't compete there, especially if you haven't done it before. We're a commercial learning ground for Chinese firms with broader ambitions. I'm talking about the Hires, ZTE corporations, Huawei Technologies, and a plethora of Chinese construction type firms as well. Taiwan, politically, it's game over. No longer a factor. This Taiwan-China competition thing is all over. Okay? There's only 4 little countries left in Africa. Not one has any semblance of resource that still recognizes Taiwan. I sympathize with our friends in Taipei, but hey, it's realpolitik. Competition with the West. We see the French, the British, especially the Americans, quite upset that China's involvement in Africa. The displacement, perhaps, of traditional interests, traditional long-term strategic interests in many African states and countries. And then we in South Africa, because we're not really Africans, yeah? Let's be honest. You know that I often say this a bit on the side, sorry. You know the Limpopo River and the Orange River, the borders? Those 2 rivers could be like the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean, because we're so far apart from the rest of the continent. Who's been to Luanda here? Hands up. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 people have been to Africa's top performing economy in the last 5 years. 6 people. Who's been to Lagos? Okay, similar number. Addis Ababa, the seat of the AU, 4 people. But if I was asked the Europeans how many people have been to Brussels, everyone would put their hands up. There's not much in Brussels besides chocolate and beer, but they still go. See my point here? So we're not really Africans, but I think this point of what I want to say here is we detach from a continent. We don't understand these issues because we're not seeing it. If you're living in DRC, in Angola, in Ethiopia, you see this, you feel it. In South Africa, you really don't, to be honest. But it's a very, very key theme. Commodity supply chains. Now, why is this important? Why commodities? Well, long-term growth, sure. But let me put it this way. Let's get back to history here. Is the LME, another one of those acronyms. We are at a business school after all, LME, what is that? London Metals Exchange. There's no metals in London. Huh? I was thinking about this recently. I landed at Heathrow and I was like, well, where's the metals? Where's the International Diamond Exchange? Anybody know? Sorry? Antwerp, in that chocolate beer place. What's it doing in Antwerp? Man, any diamonds in the ground in Belgium? Well, why is it there? Any idea? Maybe it's because the Belgians used to have this really big piece of real estate called the Congo. Not so. So, in effect, colonialism, when it comes to commodities, really screwed Africa. Because the Europeans, by design or otherwise, said, well, I'll tell you what, let's just cut these guys out the value chain. Let's put our exchanges, these trading exchanges, where the value really lies there. The value does not lie in digging a hole. The value lies in the trade and the end product. Let's establish these exchanges in European capitals. The French didn't really quite get this. Neither did the Portuguese. But the British did, and the Belgians did. And they set up these exchanges. So now, fast forward 100, 200 years later, the Chinese come to Africa and they say, you know, why do we have to buy these commodities, these expensive metals, which we need so desperately, from those British guys in the city who pay themselves so much? And why do we have to buy it from those guys in Brussels or Antwerp? You know, what have they ever done? So what do? Let's just cut out the middleman. Those of you who've done business in China, negotiated in China, you know what I'm talking about. Shake nodding heads. So cut out the middleman, go direct to Africa. If we have to deal with Bob Mugabe, he's not a nice guy, but hey, we'll do a deal. We'd rather deal with Bob than those guys in London. They may have a point there. So, where's this taking us? The securing commodity supply chains is about, and this is the kind of most important thing I think I'll say all day, 2 words: market disruption. Is to undercut, undermine the current trading mechanism, system of commodities in the global economy as we know it. Cut out London. Antwerp is peripheral. Cut out London as a London Metals Exchange and acquire those commodities at source. Every Confucianist Asian economy, whether you're Japanese, Korean, or Chinese, to an extent Singaporean, you're about controlling the assets. Whether it's state or whether it's private, it's irrelevant. Control the asset, disrupt the market. That is the long-term trend here. I predict in the next 10 to 20 years, 10 years probably a bit accurate, 20 years tops, you'll find enormous disruption to the marketplace coming out of China. How can they do this? Well, if you own the mining companies, the major ones, as a state, if you own the commodity trading companies, companies like CITIC, for example, if you own the banking system, be it commercial or policy, even if you own the shipping lines which carry those commodities, you control the entire value chain of that trade. What will you then do? You'll disrupt existing trading commodity structures. That's the big play. That is why China is in Africa. Trade. So I haven't got the 2008 breakdown yet, but it was announced last week. $106.8 billion trade last year. China is now Africa's second largest trading partner, second only to the US, number 2. The EU combined, the 20-odd countries, is bigger, but that's 20-odd countries, not one. Okay. So China is now Africa's second largest trading partner, and the growth has been absolutely phenomenal. Let me show you something. In 1993, over here somewhere, basically it's zero. The first official, sometime mid-2003, the first official Chinese delegation came to Johannesburg, ever. They were at the Standard Bank Arena by Ellis Park, if you know where it is. And I trudged along to see what this Chinese trade delegation was all about. I remember seeing about 150 guys from Guangdong province across the border from Hong Kong, selling all sorts of crap. And people were saying, what's this about? A Chinese trade delegation? Where do they come from? You know, we're not interested. That was the sense 16 years ago. Now, if you fast forward, look at that growth. They're now Africa's second largest trading partner. Who would have thought? Impossible to predict. In 1993, it was practically nothing, and it goes up to where it is today. That's exactly the same time I was first in China, about that. And unbelievable to see what has happened. Just some highlights here. 2 years ahead of target. The official government target, whatever that means, was 2010. Okay. The trade would surpass 100 billion. But again, largely because of high commodity prices, which no one really predicted, obviously that pushed up the value of that trade. We also see here trade in the last 3 years, 4 years, 5 years almost, has averaged 40% growth per annum. Now this is unbelievable growth. And it's not just, look at the trade balance. That effectively is almost balanced trade. It's about imports and it's about exports. It's not just commodities going up, it's imports as well. We're the largest importer of Chinese products. Nigeria, I think, is number 2. The largest exporter is Angola. We're number 2, along with 3 or 4 is Nigeria and Sudan. Oil and commodities, and oil is a major factor here. And the oil price being what it was, recent years, explains that. Top 10 exports. I'm going to fly through this one. Now, rather depressingly, and this is not just unique to China, is that 80% of that export profile is for commodities, which is an indication of a lack of ability to beneficiate, add value to products here in Africa. Just a quick one. I want to put this in, and I've got so many slides on, but I don't want to bore you all with figures and numbers and whatnot. But most of the figures and numbers spat out by economists in recent years, we all know it is wrong anyway. But just growth potential. You see what Europe went through in the 50s, the reconstruction of Europe after World War II. You see, fast forward to the 1960s, 70s, the industrialization of Japan. Now, I often like to glibly joke about this, but look at Japan in the 60s and 70s. Even in the early 80s, and be honest with yourselves here, chaps, which self-respecting director of a company or successful entrepreneur would drive a Toyota in 1980? Huh? Even 85, even 1990. Who would drive a Toyota? Nobody. But now, Lexus, you've arrived. So the notion of establishment of brands by emerging companies, emerging multinationals in Japan, certainly track the development of its economy up to world's number 2. Now China's 1.3 odd billion people will peak at 1.6 sometime next 25 to 30 years. 1.6 billion people, a lot of people. And we're only halfway through. That growth potential here in terms of GDP per capita is enormous. And that's been 9% average for 12 years. There is absolutely enormous growth potential. Do not believe now that China's got having a bit of a slump, that it's all over and somehow the process is going to go down to 3, 4, 5% every year. It will not. Talk about it at the end, what the growth prospects are and what it means for us as an economy. The impact in Africa. I mentioned about putting Africa back on the map, pushing out traditional actors. You know, you go to Paris, you go to Washington, D.C., and I can tell you the criticism behind closed government policy-making doors of China and Africa is intense. It really is. I think there's an enormous amount of geostrategic sort of competition here, something which we as South Africa, as a country, and many African countries have to, you're forced to, align oneself to global powers, to global interests. Will it be the traditional Europeans, Americans, or Westerns, or will it be the emerging Asians led by the Chinese, and perhaps even the Indians? Trade disruption. We all know the textile garment sector, how the undermining of the erosion of competition, inability to compete. If the Europeans can't compete on it, the Turkish can't, the Brazilians can't, what hope do we have in South Africa with a relatively small textile garment sector now? In this week's Fin Week magazine, it stated that in mid-90s, 95, 96, there was a textile garment board on the JSE with about 30 trading stocks. It was very, very active. 10 years later, it ceased to exist. Now, do you know, I actually checked the figures. Do you know how many Chinese garment manufacturing companies there are? Any idea? About 35,000. That's a lot. And the most competitive ones are not owned by the Chinese. They're owned by Taiwanese, Hong Kongese, Singaporean, and to an extent Malaysian interests. This is not so much Chinese competition as it is competition from China. There's a big difference. We're not competing with Chinese. We're competing against the world economy. What the Chinese have done is create a phenomenal platform for manufacturing and competitive manufacturing for lesser cost, cheap products. African consumer market. This phrase, the African consumer, used to be an oxymoron. Now it's a reality. Again, speak to ShopRite, speak to Massmart, and you see it happening. So there's in Angola, you'll see if you go to Luanda, you see these anywhere really, these containers arriving off the ships. Some guy cutting a hole in a container with Chinese stuff in the back, and that's his shop. That's reality. Coming across just whatever stuff you can stick in the container, sell across to Africa, land the container, and you're good to go. That's your retail operation. That's what's happening. Now that, in a South African context, the import of lesser cost clothing and garments is very deflationary. You know, and one of the main factors driving, I can tell you this quite honestly and anecdotally, is one of the main factors driving Chinese migration to Africa, of which there are hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million plus, we don't know, nobody knows the figures, of Chinese private entrepreneurs in Africa, is they can't believe how much they can sell a pair of jeans for in this country, for example, or in the continent. 30, 40 rand? In China, you pick up the same thing for $5. It's the profit margins for themselves are unbelievable. And the manufacturing in China pushing the immigration is the competition factor. It is such a highly competitive place. Deindustrialization, the hollowing out of African industry. I always hear, you want to have these sexy industries, these manufacturing value-add industries. The DTI tells us that. Huh? Every African economy wants to have this manufacturing thing. I can tell you right now, and please quote this, is that we will never have a competitive manufacturing sector in Africa to compete with Asia. We will not, unless there are some very, very hard policy decisions taken at a political level and also at a social level that enable us to become more competitive manufacturers. We cannot compete with Asia. Don't even think we can. It's game over, end of story, full stop. Let's move on. We will not be able to compete. And it's not just China. The level of regional integration of economies in Asia is, I would argue, even more integrated than what the economies of the European Union is. And that's been integrated for 50 years. It's a highly, highly competitive force. Infrastructure, I mentioned this, rapid rollout infrastructure, enabling on the continent. You know, just to get product distribution, logistics on our continent, you know, is the major challenge for doing business largely. But infrastructure rollout by Chinese companies across Africa will enable longer-term growth on the continent. We hope, however, unlike the Tanzania railway line, you know, from the Copperbelt up to Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, back in the early 70s, financed by the Chinese. It was a big white elephant project. I'm not even talking Asian elephant here, I'm talking big African elephant. It was a big African elephant white project. Does that make sense? But there must be a private sector development around that infrastructure. The Chinese are building the infrastructure now. The question is, will there be private sector involvement activity around that infrastructure? Commercial client states, Angola, you know, these concessional finance models, Angola, Gabon, Angola is about oil. Gabon's about iron ore. Liberia, iron ore. DRC, copper, cobalt. Zimbabwe, chromium and platinum. This is where these concessional finance models are going in. The finance is structured around key commodity offtake arrangements. Highly, highly strategic. And ultimately, lack of African multilateral coordination. Point on this. Okay. I took this picture in 2006, November, in Beijing. And across the whole city, if you can't see at the back, Africa, the land of myth and miracle. I came up with that. Throughout the whole of Beijing, we had this China-Africa summit, if you recall. 40 heads of state there. There were billboards everywhere of Africa, pictures of Africa. And I actually lodged a complaint to the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs for two reasons. Firstly, I said, well, you know, Africa's not about game parks. It's okay if you go to Kruger or the Serengeti, but everywhere else, let's start having a bit more progressive pictures, you know? Something which is more substantive, more industrialized, better imagery than just the zoos. The second point, there was a picture of a guy, and it was about 5 stories high, this picture on the side of a building, across many places in Beijing. I don't know if you've heard of this story. It was true. And he had this big bone, like the size of a coffee cup saucer, through his nose. And I said to our Chinese friends, I said, this guy's not African. He's from Papua New Guinea. You know? It's like us having pictures of Chinese in our buildings and having some Japanese dude in a kimono or something. You know? So I said, next time we supply the pictures. All right. But the point being here is that we had this big forum, whatever else. And very often you have situations where we as Africans, as governments, as countries, can't agree on anything. Of course the Chinese have a strategy for Africa. There's nothing wrong with that. National interest is a good thing, even if someone else has it, towards yourself. The challenge is how do we respond to it in a constructive, positive fashion. Nothing is happening at a multilateral level, I can tell you. Very, very little. It's very difficult to. Because we, South Africa, have a position. We can get the Swazis, the Lesotho's, the Botswanas, the Mozambiques, and Namibias on board, and that's where it stops. It gets to Zim and Angola, and the guys, no, different story. So this issue of regional, multilateral collaboration simply is a pipe dream. SEZs I mentioned, special economic zones. First one announced Zambia. There's actually 2 in Zambia, one on the outskirts of Lusaka, one in near Kitwe, in the Copper Belt. Chambishi, actually. There was one announced in Mauritius. The Zambia one, $1.2 billion. Copper smelter, key investment, $250 billion. Mauritius, free trade zone, near Port Louis, $400 million. Why Mauritius? Because of preferential trade access, COMESA, SADC, offshore financial center, good trade links into India, good environment for business in Mauritius. Third zone was in Suez in Egypt, being rolled out now, breaking ground. Why Egypt? Because access Maghreb Africa, North Africa, Middle East, and to an extent the EU. 2 zones in Nigeria, manufacturing assembly zones. We also have zones in Angola, near the airport, Mozambique, and Dar es Salaam. Now, a lot of this investment going in is manufacturing. In many of these countries, majority investment from China is manufacturing. It's not just commodity related. I think that's a very, very important trend. Now, the next slide, I don't mean to freak you out too much, but just bear with me, is those of you who read about Cecil Rhodes, yeah? Cecil John Rhodes, he's up on the mountain, is Cape to Cairo. Anglophone Africa, as a result of colonialism, where the Portuguese doing their thing, Mozambique, Angola, the French, West Africa, Belgium, Congo, French influence, Ethiopia of Italians, and then from south, this corridor from southern East Africa, British colonies, not so, Anglophone Africa. The Europeans did not collaborate much when it came to infrastructure development. As a result, the infrastructure corridor is in a north-south sort of spine. Everything mined around Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, southern DRC, down to South Africa and out. This has been reinforced by conflict in Mozambique for 20-odd years, Angola the same, and also the DRC over recent years. It was the only effective transportation corridor was this. Every mine around here comes down and out. Okay, around here. What is happening now? We have the rehabilitation of the Tanzan railway line from Copperbelt up to Dar es Salaam. We have also, and I have these fantastic maps, all in Chinese, of road projects, of rail projects, of Chinese infrastructure rollout from west coast of Africa, around the Bito, Benguela area, and also coming in from the northern part of the northwest of the DRC, coming down here, this direction here. And effectively, what is happening is having the first ever really functioning east-west transportation corridor slicing the continent in two. This is what's taking place right now. Now, a few people know about this. I'm not sure who the new head of Transnet is going to be, but hopefully he or she knows about this. Strategically, this is not good for South Africa. Strategically. Commercially, maybe a good idea. Strategically, it is not. So Africa is divided. There's two dividing lines across Africa. One is where the Sahara Desert, kind of like Chad, kind of ends, Sudan. Northern part of Africa, Sub-Sahara, subdivided further. There's three sections of Africa: Central, North Africa, and Southern Africa. And this is being cut off largely. This is the plan. This is the grand plan. Very, very interesting. And I think the last slide, just to talk about the impact on this. Summary thoughts. Our growth trajectories are intertwined, and I would say our growth destinies are certainly shared. Currently now, China's growth has dropped to about 5.5%, 6%. Last quarter performance, 6.8% officially. In times of crisis, 1989, 1990, 1998, 1999, so it was after Tiananmen Square, all that nonsense happened then. 1998, 1999, Asian financial crisis. China's official growth rate and real growth rate was approximately a 2% differential, where China's government says it's 2% higher than it actually is. Official growth last quarter, 6.8. So it could be 4.85. Compared to what it was this time last year, 13%. Now that growth has fallen off a cliff. Did it happen because US consumers suddenly figured out they had no more money left and stopped buying? No. I would argue, long story, that perhaps this entire crisis is partly due to decisions taken in Beijing to start to slow down growth. China's slowdown in growth preempted the global financial crisis, Bear Stearns, Lehman, and these guys. You had, in recent years, since 2006, you had Hu Jintao, all the leadership saying, we're growing too fast. We need to slow down. Remember? Can you imagine a head of state of any country saying, guys, we've got to slow this stuff down? Now, imagine Thabo Mbeki or Atlanta now saying, 3%. That's too high. Let's slow it down. It doesn't make sense. The Chinese government, out of fear of overheating the economy, rising inflationary forces in the last 18-odd months, intentionally sabotaged its own development, or own growth trajectory, by cutting back on infrastructure and property development, by turning the capital tax off. That's what happened. That resulted in the slowdown and the fall-off in the commodity demand. Now the question is, it came at the worst possible time, because look what's happened everywhere else now. The China's like, oh, hell, shouldn't have done that. Now it's like, turn the taps back on as fast as you can. That's what's happening. That's happening right now. It's turn those taps. So lending is up. I think the December figure was a 19% increase in lending in China. It's phenomenal. So now the question is, will we get back to 13? Well, we just lost the US consumer. And Stephen Roach from Morgan Stanley said, the US consumer is toast. Said it at WF last year in China in September. So good news for Africa. undoubtedly good news for Africa. We are dependent on decisions taken in Beijing and how the Chinese economy reacts to those decisions. Third point. We spoke of this on Friday. Macquarie was having a China Day, and the question was, can Chinese banks act in a counter-cyclical fashion? And the answer is yes. One assumes that Chinese banks are now more free market players, and they're called commercial banks now, and the politicians don't really control the place. It's nonsense. China's state-owned banks, and one commentator said this so well, state-owned banks in China are all effectively state-owned, majority state. A few been spun out, BOC, China Construction Bank, part listing in Hong Kong, just to dupe the foreigners to stump up large amounts of cash. That's it. Which is totally worth it. So maximum 20-25% foreign shareholding. The banks have gone from state-owned to Beijing-owned. So the banks in China are more centralized control now compared to ever before, ever, post-49. So can they act in a counter-cyclical fashion? Or when when Hua Xin or Liu Gu, or these guys who are CEOs of the banks, are appointed by Beijing, and their bosses say, you start lending, they start lending. And that is what's happening right now. Our banks are saying, whoa, Eon, you're a big risk. We're not going to lend you a cent. Chinese banks say, well, my boss told me to lend to those guys, I'm going to lend to those guys. Let's just boost that economy in some way. Pump prime the economy. That's what's happening. Decoupling may still be possible. We're rubbish to decoupling theory, but if China comes back, I go back to my original point. Which economy was growing which major economy was growing substantially in 1930, 31, 32? Zero. Nobody. Nobody was. The Japanese were doing something interesting. But it was a major global sort of hit. Now, we expect, come second, third quarter, Chinese growth would have picked up quite significantly. Nowhere back to the roaring heights of 12, 13, 14% plus. But 7, 8%, pretty good performance. And that's good news for us here in Africa. Commodity imports. Again, the drop-off in commodities. We were told as well on Friday, someone said, I forget who it was, this is one of the hotels here, that there are currently 50 ships, Cape-sized ships, outside Shanghai port, full of iron ore, waiting to get in. A month ago, no one was there. The stockpiling of certain key commodities, and also buying when prices are relatively subdued. Has anyone been to Shanghai port, by the way? Impressive. You've got to go to see it once in your life. Go to Shanghai port. It's unbelievable. Can you imagine the situation just to the total side? Cape Town port, your port is around your waterfront, yeah? Imagine if the water wasn't deep enough. The water was like silty and shallow. That's Shanghai. So what do? You build your port 30 kilometers out to sea. You build a 6-lane highway, 3 lanes either way, on a bridge, going out for 35 kilometers out to sea. You can't even see it. It's over the horizon. 35 kilometers. There's a few little islets which they kind of reclaim land, put together, and build the world's biggest port. World's biggest deep water port. Shanghai. You should go and see it sometime. It's unbelievable. Sovereign wealth funds. Now they're called savior wealth funds. A year ago, Sarkozy, Blair was around, Gordon Brown then, I don't know. George Bush, everyone was saying, sovereign wealth funds. What's these things? What's this business about states making investments? That is counter to our ideology. We say private business is private and government is government. A year later, practically every European major bank is being nationalized by governments. So, but undoubtedly sovereign wealth funds. It was announced by Financial Times, I think on Friday. Chip Goodyear, former CEO of BHP Billiton, has now become CEO of Temasek, one of the major Singaporean sovereign wealth funds. What are the Singaporeans going to be doing? Buying up commodities now. Why? Because A, they're cheap, and B, we believe in China. We believe that in the next 30, 40, 50 years, 700, 800 million Chinese are going to become wealthier, and they're going to move to cities, and they're going to want to start to buy stuff. That's what Singaporeans totally believe. And sovereign wealth funds will start buying these in Africa as well. SEZs, I spoke about those, the new focal points in Africa, the new commercial clusters of Chinese investment on the continent. South African interests increasingly owning key sectors, infrastructure, commodities particularly, will intersect. And I use that word very carefully, intersect. It's a very neutral word. Well, some would say collaborate, some would say collide, I would say intersect in Africa. And I think this is a very, very strategic thing to start to consider by SA Inc., by our government, and also regional governments. Developmental model, a post-Bretton Woods developmental model. The Chinese say IMF, World Bank, WTO. That's interesting. But we won't really abide by their rules. The Chinese intent here is to change the rules of the global game. That is it. When you speak to guys in China, Beijing, the top chaps, State Council, CEOs of the banks, especially the policy banking side, Exim Bank in particular, the culture, the vision is such to change the rules of the game. Once again, guys, we're in this WBN space. We can't really see the forest for the trees. But a very, very different perspective of how the world should be run exists in China. And here in Africa, we're saying, well, we know this aid model thing doesn't work. We've proven that. The Vatican works, but we don't have religion. So for us, it doesn't work. The Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, have done very little, let's be honest, with Africa or for Africa in the last 50 years. Now, of course, we can't blame them. We're the major culprits of our own lack of developmental success. We're the architects of our own failure on this continent. There's no doubt about that. But in terms of China, does China offer a new developmental model? Is it a model that one can understand, can come up with like a toolkit, a how-to get 10%, 11, 12, 13% growth for 20, 30 years and uplift 300-400 million people out of poverty? Is there a model? And these are the questions certainly which are being asked and posed now, right now, amongst every single African government. Because it's plainly obvious. The IMF and World Bank have been telling us everything the last 50 years, and the last 3 months have done exactly the opposite themselves. The whole model is discredited entirely, and it's going to change the world. We're now in the process of it. We're too much in crisis mode. We're too worried about our bonds and mortgages and our car repayments to see the bigger picture. The bigger picture is this crisis will have some serious political implications for this continent and also developmental implications long-term around policy issues. And the last one is we must position ourselves toward this. I think it's obvious. We all know London very well. Heathrow, we sometimes call death row, but we still go to it. I think we need to understand Britain changed our world a couple of centuries ago. China's changing our world now. We need to understand it. We're traveling there, doing business there. Ultimately, it comes down to trust. Can we trust? Do Chinese, do Africans trust each other? How do we build that trust? For more long-term, really long-term, sustainable sort of benefit here on the receiving side. And we should always be on the receiving side, perhaps the more proactive side as well. Thank you very much.